Have you ever been playing a game, a simple childhood game like hide and seek, and had that fleeting moment of panic arise within you? That split second where you're hiding, and it suddenly feels a little too real. You wait for your friends to find you. The silence stretches on, as a tiny, primal part of your brain begins to whisper. What if they never come? What if you are just lost forever? For most of us, that feeling vanishes as quickly as it comes. We hear footsteps, a shout of our name, and the game is over. But what if it wasn't? What if the game never ended? What if that single playful game was the final normal moment of your life? This is the story of a boy who went out to play in the mountains on a perfect summer afternoon and was never seen again. It's a story that, on the surface, seems tragically simple, but the deeper you dig, the more the layers of strangeness and mystery begin to pile up. This isn't just a story about a lost child. It's a story about the massive search that followed, a baffling lack of evidence, and a single, bone-chilling sighting that could change everything you think you know about the American wilderness. Welcome to Timorus, a podcast dedicated to chilling disappearances and horrific true crimes. Today, we're talking about the disappearance of Dennis Martin. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a place of breathtaking beauty, the most visited national park in the entire United States, a place that families go to make wonderful memories. But on Father's Day weekend in 1969, for one family in particular, it became the site of a memory so nightmarish and so profoundly baffling that it continues to haunt the region more than 50 years later. For generations, the men of the Martin family had a special tradition. Every year, on Father's Day weekend, they'd leave their home in Knoxville, Tennessee, and head for the mountains. It was a rite of passage, a time for fathers, sons, and grandfathers to connect with nature alongside one another. In June of 1969, it was 6-year-old Dennis's turn. It was his first time on this grand adventure with his father, William Martin, who everyone called Bill, his 9-year-old brother Douglas, and their grandfather, Clyde Martin. Dennis was a quiet kid, just 6 days away from his 7th birthday. He was described as energetic, a fast walker who often led the pack on family hikes, brimming with that childish energy and profound sense of wonder. On Friday, June 13th, the four of them hiked the well-worn trail from Cades Cove up to Russell Field, where they camped for the night. The next day, Saturday, June 14th, they made the final push, a 90-minute hike along the Appalachian Trail to a place called Spence Field. Spence Field is a highland meadow, a beautiful grassy clearing, or a bald as they're called in the Appalachians. In June, it's famous for its blooming mountain laurel and rhododendron. It's an incredibly popular spot, a welcome respite from the dense forest. When the Martins arrived, they met up with another family, that of a Dr. Carter Martin from Alabama. They shared the same last name, but weren't related. What they did share, however, was 2 young sons, who were around the same age as Dennis and Douglas. It was late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m. The adults were relaxing, taking in the views while the 4 boys, Dennis, Douglas, and the 2 sons of Dr. Martin, did what boys do. They huddled together, whispering and giggling, hatching a plan. Bill Martin watched them, amused. He could overhear their little plot. They were going to sneak off to the edge of the field, circle around through the bushes, then jump out to give the grown-ups a good scare. It was a perfect, innocent moment of childhood fun. But It was about to turn into every parent's worst nightmare. As the boys prepared to launch their sneak attack, they hit a snag. Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt. In the logic of a child's game, this was a problem. His bright red shirt was far too easy to spot and would ruin the surprise. So the older boys gave him a simple instruction. He needed to go off in a different direction by himself so that his red shirt wouldn't give their game away. It's a detail that is almost too ironic and cruel to believe. The one thing that should have made him safest, the bright color that would make him visible from a distance, was a reason he was sent off alone to hide out of sight. This would lead to unimaginable horror. His father, Bill, watched him go. He saw his 6-year-old son, in his bright red shirt and green shorts, step behind a clump of bushes just a short distance away, ready to play his part in the prank when he was given the signal. When that signal came and went, however, Dennis was nowhere to be seen. This was the last time anyone saw Dennis Martin. A moment later, the other 3 boys leaped out from their hiding spots, shouting and laughing. The adults, long having known their plan, played along, pretending to be surprised. Everybody was having fun. But as the laughter died down, a question hung in the air. Where was Dennis? Bill Martin assumed he was just lagging behind, but a minute passed, then 2, and then 5. Bill's amusement and excitement quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He knew his son. Dennis was quiet, but he wasn't the wanderer, and he would always answer when he was called. Bill started calling his name. The forest gave back pure silence. As he began to search, the other family members joined in, their voices echoing across the meadow. Nothing. The game was over, and Dennis was nowhere to be seen. Something was terribly wrong. Bill's fatherly instinct screamed that this wasn't just a boy who was lost in a game. This was an emergency. He took off, sprinting down the trail, shouting his son's name over and over, his voice raw with panic, fearing the absolute worst. He ran for nearly 2 full miles down the trail before the realization set in that his little 6-year-old son couldn't possibly have gotten this far, or at least not on his own. Now remember, this was 1969. There were no cell phones, no satellite messengers, certainly no Wi-Fi. Spence Field is extremely remote. To get help back in those days, you had to physically walk back the trail and go get it. As the afternoon lights began to fade, Bill and his father made a decision. Bill would stay and continue to search the area around the field, while Clyde, the grandfather, would begin the grueling 9-mile hike back down the mountain to the ranger station at Cades Cove to sound the alarm. Just imagine that hike. 9 miles. A grandfather, his heart pounding with fear for his grandson, racing against the setting sun, every step taking him further away from where the boy was last seen. He finally reached the ranger station at 8:30 p.m., a full 4 hours after Dennis had vanished. The official search could now begin. As darkness fell over the Smokies, something else was rolling in. A storm. And it wasn't just a summer shower. It was a violent, vicious thunderstorm that unleashed havoc on the mountains. In a matter of hours, over 2.5 inches of rain hammered Spence Field. Dwight McCarter, a legendary park ranger and tracker who had become deeply involved in the search for Dennis, later said the storm was so intense the people huddled in the nearby shelter couldn't even manage to light a fire. Streams swelled into raging, turbulent torrents. The temperature plummeted to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be lethal for a small child in a soaked t-shirt and shorts. But the storm did something else, something that would define this case forever. It acted as an eraser. It scrubbed the mountainside clean of tracks. It washed away every footprint, every broken twig, and every scent trail. It destroyed any and all evidence of which way a little 6-year-old boy may have gone. That storm is one of the reasons that the disappearance of Dennis Martin isn't just a tragedy. It's a perfect mystery. It was a catalyst that created a vacuum of facts, a complete absence of evidence that brought speculation, rumor, and even dark folklore to rush in and fill the void. When the sun rose on Sunday, June 15th, the original search for Dennis Martin began in earnest. And it would become the largest, most extensive search operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The response was staggering. It started with park rangers and rescue squads from nearby counties in Tennessee and North Carolina, but word spread like wildfire. Soon, Boy Scouts who were camping nearby joined in. College forestry students from the University of Tennessee hiked up to help. Firefighters, police officers, and hundreds upon hundreds of concerned local volunteers poured into the area, wanting to do something, anything, to find this lost and likely frightened little boy. The effort escalated. The Tennessee Highway Patrol sent a helicopter to fly Bill Martin over the search area so he could call out for his son with a loudspeaker. Then the military got involved. Huey helicopters from Warner Robins Air Force Base were dispatched. The Tennessee Air National Guard then arrived. And then, in a move that would later fuel countless conspiracy theories, a unit of about 60 Green Berets, elite Special Forces soldiers from Fort Bragg, were brought in to assist. At its peak, there were a staggering 1,400 people combing a 56-square-mile area of some of the most rugged terrain in the eastern United States. Spence Field was transformed into a military-style base camp, with helicopters ferrying searchers and equipment up the mountain. The cost of the operation ballooned to over $50,000, a huge sum for a rescue operation in 1969. It was a monumental wave of humanity, all focused on one simple goal: finding Dennis Martin. And it was a catastrophic failure. It's a hard thing to say, but the very thing that made the search so impressive, its huge size, is what doomed it from the start. Back in 1969, the National Park Service didn't have a standardized, scientific protocol for search and rescue operations like they do nowadays. This means the response was improvised, and it quickly descended into chaos as countless more people than were needed joined the mix, with poor organization guiding them. Let's go back to Dwight McCarter, the park ranger and tracker. He was there, he was experienced, and he saw it all firsthand. Years later, he would describe the problem with brutal clarity. He said, "If you've got 1,400 people, they've stomped on everything. It just doesn't work. We did searches back then like they were forest fires. You surrounded it and drowned it." Just think about that image. Surrounding and drowning. The overwhelming flood of well-intentioned but completely untrained volunteers was, in effect, a second, far more devastating storm. The first storm, the rain, washed away the initial clues that Dennis may have left. The second storm, the people, trampled over everything that might have remained. Expert trackers like McCarter look for the tiniest signs: a broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, even a single footprint. But with hundreds of people crisscrossing the same area, the scene became hopelessly contaminated. Scent trails for the search dogs were obliterated by the smell of 1,400 other humans being in the area. At one point, a child-sized footprint made by an Oxford-style shoe, the exact type that Dennis was wearing, was found. It was a potentially vital clue, but got dismissed. Why? because a troop of Boy Scouts was also part of the search, and it was assumed the print must have belonged to one of them. This clue was later lost in the noise and disarray. The search became a textbook case of how not to run a rescue operation. It was a failure born of the best intentions. The community's powerful, empathetic, inspiring response to help a family in crisis inadvertently ensured that the mystery would never be solved. But here is the most important and heartbreaking paradox of this entire story. The complete failure to find Dennis Martin became a catalyst for revolutionary change. This case was so notoriously botched that it forced search and rescue professionals across the country and eventually the world to stop and say, "We can never let this happen again." Experts analyzed the chaos of the Martin search and developed new, scientific search and rescue systems. They created what's now known as the Incident Command System, or ICS, a standardized way to manage large-scale emergencies, ensuring that a search is controlled and methodical, instead of a complete free-for-all. They then began studying lost person behavior, creating psychological profiles to predict where a person of a certain age and condition is most likely to go. They also learned that a small number of highly trained searchers is infinitely more efficient than a large, untrained crowd. The lessons from the failure to find one little boy in the Smokies have been directly responsible for saving countless lives in the decades since. Park officials today will tell you that tens of thousands of people have been found, rescued, and returned to their families because of the protocols that were created from this tragedy. It's a disturbing legacy, a legacy of life born from a story of its loss. The search for Dennis Martin was a search for a single clue, a single piece of certainty in a storm of chaos. When a massive search turns up absolutely nothing, not a body, not a shoe, not even a single thread from a bright red t-shirt, you're left in a vacuum. And in that vacuum of uncertainty, theories begin to form. In the case of Dennis Martin, these theories typically fall into three categories. The first, and the one favored by the National Park Service, is the most straightforward theory, and, in its own way, the most terrifying. Theory 1 is that Dennis simply got lost, wandered a short distance from the trail, and succumbed to the elements. The environment at Spence Field is perfectly suited for this kind of tragedy. The terrain is extremely deceptive. From the meadows, it's downhill in almost every direction, into a jungle of dense rhododendron and mountain laurel thickets. Locals call them Rhodo Hells for a reason. You can step off a trail and be completely swallowed by the vegetation in a matter of feet. The ground is a tangle of roots and rocks, pocked with depressions and steep, hidden ravines. Sound doesn't travel particularly well. An incessant wind often whips over the ridge, drowning out any potential calls for help. A 6-year-old boy, disoriented and panicked, could easily fall, become injured, or even crawl into a dense thicket for shelter and never be seen again. Then there was the weather. The combination of the torrential rain and the 50-degree temperatures would have brought on hypothermia with terrifying speed. In this scenario, Dennis likely didn't survive the first night. He would have passed away somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, his small body hidden from view, never to be found. But there is a substantial hole in this theory, which many online have pointed out: the complete and total lack of evidence. It is the core of the entire mystery. With 1,400 people searching, you would expect something to turn up. A shoe, his shorts, that bright red shirt even, could have been a beacon against the forest green. Even if he did indeed pass away, searchers were specifically looking for signs of decomposition, watching for vultures in the sky. And they found nothing. Not then, not now, not ever. How can a person and everything they are wearing simply cease to exist, never to be discovered. For many, the lack of any physical trace makes the simple lost and perished theory feel incomplete, almost impossible. Which brings us to Theory 2, a wildlife attack. The Smokies are home to a healthy population of black bears, as well as feral pigs. Some reports from the time suggested that a recent drought had made the bears hungrier and bolder than usual. Could a predatory animal have snatched the boy and carried him off? On the surface, it certainly seems plausible. It is the wilderness after all. But when you dig deep into the data, this theory also begins to fall apart. First, fatal black bear attacks are incredibly rare. In the entire recorded history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, there have been only 2, and neither of them happened anywhere near 1969. A detailed Park Service report covering the years 1964 to 1976 documented 107 instances of bears causing injury to humans. But the vast majority of these were minor scratches or bites that occurred along roadsides where tourists were illegally feeding the bears, habituating them to humans and food. A predatory attack deep in the backcountry is a different animal altogether, and it's far from typical behavior for a black bear. Unlike grizzlies, black bears are not known for being fiercely territorial or defensive of their young in the same way. More importantly, even in the extremely rare case of a predatory attack, it's highly unlikely that the animal would consume a person entirely, clothing and all, leaving absolutely no trace. No blood, no torn fabric, no scattered remains for a 1,400-person search party to find. While you can of course never say never, the wildlife attack theory just doesn't line up with the evidence, or lack thereof. So, if he wasn't lost to the elements, and he wasn't taken by an animal, that leaves the third and most sinister possibility. This theory is the one his family held onto, because it was the only one that offered even a sliver of hope that he might be out there somewhere, still alive. Theory 3 is that Dennis Martin was abducted. Taken, not by an animal, but by a human. The FBI was brought in to investigate this possibility, though they repeatedly stated that there was no concrete evidence of foul play. Regardless of this, however, there is one testimony that has fueled this theory for over 50 years. This is the story told by the Key family. On the same Saturday afternoon that Dennis went missing, a man named Harold Key was hiking with his family in an area called Rowan's Creek, which is about 5 to 7 miles from Spence Field as the crow flies, and closer to 9 miles if you follow the twisting mountain trails. Sometime that afternoon, they heard a sound that chilled them to the bone. Harold Key described it as an enormous, sickening scream. Concerned it might be one of their own children being attacked by a bear, they looked around frantically. A few moments later, they saw a man. He was described as shaggy, unkempt, and rough-looking, and he was moving quickly, almost running, through the dense brush, trying to stay hidden. This story has been told in many forms over the past 50 years. Some of these versions, including Key's own official testimony, claim that the man was carrying something bundled up over his shoulder, something that might have been a piece of cloth or clothing. Now, at the time, the Keys didn't know a child was missing. They thought that maybe they had stumbled upon an illegal moonshiner or something of the sort. It was only a few days later, when they heard the news about the search for Dennis Martin, that they reported what they had seen to the authorities. This sole testimony is the bedrock of the abduction theory, but it does have problems. The biggest one for investigators was the sheer distance. Could an abductor really grab a child at Spence Field and cover 9 miles of rugged uphill and downhill trail in the relatively short amount of time between Dennis's disappearance and the sighting? It seemed highly unlikely. The FBI and Park Service largely concluded that the sighting, while strange, was likely unrelated. But in the court of public opinion, and in the realm of folklore, the image of that shaggy, rough-looking man took on a life of its own. It became the seed for a persistent and dark piece of Appalachian lore, the legend of the feral people. Stories began to circulate, whispers of wild, inbred clans living deep in the mountains, completely cut off from society, who were responsible for Dennis's disappearance. The fact that the Green Berets were brought in only added fuel to this fire, with conspiracy theories claiming their real mission was not to find Dennis, but to hunt and exterminate these wild men who had taken him. There is, of course, no evidence to support any of this. It's a story born from a deep-seated fear of the unknown, something that is innate within all of us, a narrative created to explain what is entirely unexplainable. It is perhaps easier for the human mind to invent a monster than to accept the terrifying randomness of a child simply being lost to the wilderness. The story of the feral man tells us a lot more about our own need for answers than it does about what likely happened to Dennis Martin. In the end, all we have are these competing narratives. A boy lost to the merciless indifference of nature, a boy taken by a predator in a vanishingly rare event, or a boy stolen by a phantom seen fleetingly from a distance. None of these theories fit perfectly. All of them leave you with a deep sense of unease. The search for Dennis Martin was officially scaled back on June 29th, 2 weeks after he disappeared, and finally closed in September. For his family, though, it never ended. According to neighbors and even a family member who later spoke out, Dennis's parents, Bill and Violet Martin, were never the same. The vibrant, happy family was shattered by a grief that has no name, the grief of not knowing. Bill was described as hysterical during the search and couldn't bring himself to return to work for a long, long time. They lived out the rest of their lives under the suffocating shadow of that unanswered question, passing away without ever learning the fate of their son. It is a unique and particularly cruel form of suffering to be denied the closure of a final answer of the most traumatic experience of their lives. The story of Dennis Martin is a chilling reminder of how thin the veil is between our safe, orderly world and the chaos of the wild. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite involving over 1,400 searchers, despite involving military organizations and helicopters, a person can simply vanish, never to be seen or heard from again. The mountains hold their secret close, and it's unlikely that we will ever know for sure what happened to Dennis Martin. But his disappearance was not without meaning. Yes, it's true, the search for him was a failure, but the lessons learned from that failure built the foundation of modern search and rescue, not just in America, but across the world. Because of the traumatic chaos at Spence Field in 1969, a new form of science was born, a science that has allowed tens of thousands of other lost children, hikers, and wanderers to be found. Tens of thousands of other families who were spared the unending agony that the Martins had to endure for so long. Dennis Martin was lost so that others could be found. It's a haunting, heartbreaking, but important legacy. His name may be attached to one of the nation's most unsettling mysteries, but it is also attached, even if quietly, to countless happy reunions that have happened in the half-century since. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed the introductory episode of Timorus. I first heard the story of Dennis Martin a little over 10 years ago when I was a young teenager. It was the first story that completely stuck with me, so deeply that I'm able to tell it by heart to this day. It is what initially brought me to true crime and disappearances, and motivated me to start researching and sharing the tales of people who have been lost around the world in various different ways. If there are any cases you would like for me to cover, please feel free to get in contact through our YouTube comments section or send in a message through our Spotify page. Thank you once again for listening. And remember, there are some things far more frightening than death.